Thank you, Catherine, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a huge pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the organisers for the invitation to chair this first session, and of course to add my thanks to our generous patron Christian Levitt, who has enabled this whole day to happen. I think sculptural display is a completely brilliant topic for a conference, and you perhaps won't be surprised to hear me say so, because in the museum world, how best to display sculpture is, of course, a very practical, a very pressing concern. The problem with sculptures is that they are generally big and heavy. It's not easy to try them out, to make adjustments as you go along. They require lifting gear, tackle, ropes, lifting machinery of all sorts, and highly skilled technicians who can gently heave and then maneuver them into place. And you can imagine that said technicians would not be too pleased if you stood back from the result and said, it's lovely, but could you just move it 6 inches to the right? It's kind of not going to happen. There is a huge pressure to get it right first time. We can, museums and galleries in general, I mean, we can be more experimental perhaps in special exhibitions, in short-term exhibitions. And the ones that we do in the British Museum or that I see around the world, in my mind, I sort of place on a spectrum which runs from the white cube to the black box approach. And by the white cube approach, I mean sculptures displayed at low level, in natural light. And I use the term because it's very much the approach espoused by Anthony Gormley when he was guest curator of an exhibition in the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. And what he did there with the Grand Tour type sculpture he was working with was to create a low plinth and sink the statue bases into the plinth, which was also the floor levels for the visitor. So you completely confronted the figural sculpture as a figure yourself with your feet on exactly the same level. I think it was a really interesting example of a modern creator of sculpture sort of channeling the ancient creator and trying to give to the visitor, to the viewer, a really very immediate experience. The black box display, by contrast, what I mean by that is more the way that we did our exhibition Defining Beauty, a special exhibition in the British Museum 2 years ago, where we had an entirely dark gallery, either black or dark colours, and entirely artificial light. The sculptures in that show were put onto plinths, and I suppose in that sense, in some instances at least, they were nearer to the way that they would have been seen and displayed in antiquity. And our big idea there, I think, was to try to create drama and excitement in the encounters with the sculptures that the visitors saw. And of course, both approaches have validity, and there are many other sort of points along that spectrum and other considerations that have to be borne in mind. Adjacencies and groupings of works, certainly. Also the architectural setting of the room or the gallery in which you're doing your display. And the background colours of the walls and floors. It's actually possible to get it really quite wrong, and I'm rather sorry to say that if you want an example of a not terribly successful display of a sculpture, go and look in the Great Court of the British Museum. We have a lovely Roman equestrian sculpture of really quite considerable scale on a high plinth, but he's diminished by the huge space that he's in, and the colour of the marble is almost exactly the same colour as the walls of the Great Court. And so the visitor could be forgiven for overlooking him almost completely, which is not really a particularly satisfactory effect. It doesn't really work at all. I'm sure that everyone in this room has seen good and bad, successful or less successful displays of sculpture. Of course, to some extent, it is always going to be a matter of taste. But I'm sure nobody would deny the basic starting position for the display of classical sculpture, which is that we really do have to begin from as good an understanding and awareness as we can possibly achieve of the original ancient setting. Even if we then decide not to try to replicate that, to move completely away from it, our starting point must be understanding as well as we can how it would have looked in the ancient world. And that's why I'm particularly excited about this conference. I think it is a fabulous topic, and we have 6 entirely brilliant expert speakers to talk to us about all aspects of this question. So it's a pleasure now to move on to introduce the first 3 of them. And our first speaker is Professor Olga Palagia, who joins us from Athens, where for many years now she's been Professor of Classical Archaeology at the National and Kapodostrian University of Athens. She studied there herself as a student before going on to Oxford, where she was awarded her D.Phil. And her courses in Athens and her research interests have focused on classical sculpture in Greece from the 5th century to the Roman period, and also very particularly on the art of Macedonia. I think her students have been very lucky, because Olga Palagia has probably forgotten more about Greek sculpture than any of us will ever know. But I have to say, Olga, that's just a figure of speech. I know you don't ever forget anything. But certainly her bibliography is immense, and as I was printing it out, I sort of thought the printer might give up the ghost as it churned and churned and churned. She's published importantly on aspects of the technique of ancient sculpture, on the Parthenon sculptures, the Bassai sculptures, other works from particular monuments, works from particular sites and areas, and works by individual sculptors. Her range has been really incredibly wide. Her familiarity with the sculpture collections in Athens is, of course, second to none. Her first academic post before she went back to the university was actually at the Acropolis Museum, and she's worked on the collections of the National Museum as a curator in the Binaki Museum, and also contributed to exhibition work internationally. And while Athens is her home base, she's been very energetic in sharing her research and her learning around the world, with visiting fellowships, particularly in America, in Princeton, Washington, New York, and elsewhere. And I'm pleased to say she's also been a very frequent visitor to London. She's given lectures both here in the university and in the British Museum, and she's been a really stalwart friend and supporter of our endeavours at the British Museum for many years. She's always very generous with her insights and her expertise. So it's therefore my huge pleasure to see her here again, to welcome her, and to invite her to deliver her paper on sculptural display in Greek temples. Olga Palagia.
Well, I can start now. Thank you very much. Thank you, Leslie, for this very generous introduction. It's always a great pleasure to be back in London, and I come back as often as I can to stir up things, and I've been stirring up things in these storerooms. So you will hear from me again. Now, the aim of this paper is to investigate the arrangement of statues in the interior of Greek temples on the basis of the archaeological evidence and the descriptions of the traveler Pausanias, who toured Greece in the 3rd quarter of the 2nd century AD. A Greek temple was a sacred space, and its main purpose was to shelter the cult statue of the deity or deities to which the temple was dedicated. It was in fact understood as the house of the god or goddess. Animal sacrifices to the gods took place on the altar, which was located outside, though other gifts could be placed on an offering table set up in front of the cult statue. Temples normally faced east to capture first light. Visibility of the statues inside would have been poor, since most temples lacked windows. But there must have been enough light from oil lamps judging by the fact that visitors were expected to be able to read the inscriptions on the statue bases, for many pedestals were inscribed, including occasionally the pedestals of the cult statues. In order to get a sense of the display of cult statues in antiquity, the modern visitor is advised to visit a neoclassical church of the early 19th century. For example, the Cathedral of Copenhagen, designed by the Danish architect Christian Hansen, with Bertel Thorvaldsen's statue of Christ. This is inspired mainly by Roman models, setting the statue within a niche and lacking the polychromy one would expect of Greek prototypes. The Parthenon in Nashville, created in the early 20th century, offers a more academic approach to the interior of a Greek temple, recreating the interior colonnade of the original Parthenon as a backdrop for a colossal copy of the Athena Parthenos by Phidias. The statue is an erudite variant of the lost original and is dependent on the interpretation of reduced copies of the Roman period, while the figures on the statue base are mostly imaginary. Whereas the original Athena was made of ivory and gold, the copy is made of plaster covered in gold leaf. The original base of the Athena was of blue Eleusinian limestone with applique gold and ivory figures, whereas the copy is of blue marble from Carrara with relief figures again covered in gold leaf. Due to a miscalculation, the statue is 13 instead of 11 meters high, because they calculated also the height of the base and they added it to the statue. It is in any case incredibly effective and awe-inspiring, no doubt on account of its grand scale and precious material, regardless of the religious beliefs of the modern visitor. And they have very wisely set up a bench. As soon as you enter the temple, there is a bench on your left, and that's where I collapsed the first time I saw this statue, because it's really frightening. A drawing of the cult statue of the Nemesis by Phidias' pupil Agorakritos in her temple at Rhamnous on the right reflects an archaeologist's idea of a cult statue displayed within a temple, and everything is neatly arranged in a sanitized space, exactly as the Nashville Parthenos appears to the modern visitor. But a visit to the Nashville Parthenon does not tell the whole story of the contents of a Greek temple. Only small temples in the countryside contained nothing but the cult statue. A good example is offered by the temple of Cybele, mother of the gods, excavated in Moschato near Piraeus in 1970. This was a modest temple in Antis without columns, built in the early 4th century BC. Its square cella measures 260 by 260 meters and contained an under-life-size marble cult statue of the mother of the gods, who was accompanied by her sacred animal, the lion, set up on a separate pedestal. On the left, you see the ground plan of the temple as it was found, and on the right, you see a reconstruction. The main cults of Cybele in the area of Athens and Attica were housed in the Mitron of the Athenian Agora and in another big temple in Piraeus, which has yet to be recovered. The temple in Moschato is no more than a local chapel. The height of the pedestal of the goddess is only 27 centimeters, while the lion stood on a pedestal of 66. The goddess was therefore displayed at a low height within reach of the worshipper. The rough peaked back of the statue indicates that she was flush against the wall. She was not found in her original position, but pushed against the south wall here, probably during the last phase of the temple in late antiquity. Her original position was in the center of the cella, here. In the Hellenistic period, the temple floor was refurbished and painted yellow in front of the statue with red strips on the sides. The statue is now set up in the Piraeus Museum, and it's vaguely reminiscent of the original arrangement. She dates from the early 4th century and is of great interest to the art historian, being a reduced variant of the famous cult statue of the Mother of the Gods by Agorakritos, the pupil of Phidias, which originally stood in the Mitron of the Athenian Agora. The Cybele of Moschato is enthroned, her feet resting on a footstool, and must have held the tambourine in the left hand and the fiali in the right, as you see in the reconstruction drawing. She wears a belted peplos over a chiton with long sleeves and a himation over both. A Roman copy of Agorakritos' original statue has been recognized in the Cybele from Lebadia on the right, which is now in the Cheironia Museum, and you can see the 4th century variant on the left, which is slightly different. Even more modest than the Temple of Moschato is the Temple of Demeter and Kori, which was built outside the fortification walls of the Aetolian city of Callion. It's not far from Delphi. The cult is identified by means of a votive inscription. The temple is a plain square room measuring 480 by 480 meters. It is very likely a thesmophorion because it is situated just outside the city walls. It dates from the early 3rd century BC and was in use until late antiquity. It contained a marble pedestal with cavities for the plinths of a pair of marble statues. You can't see the cursor, right? Unfortunately. I don't have a pointer, but you can see it there. When the temple was excavated between 1977 and 1979, one of the two statues was found almost intact, fallen in front of the base, face forward. The statue is almost 2 meters high and represents Kori, or Persephone, made of Pentelic marble in an Attic style and therefore by an Attic sculptor. She is now housed in the Amphissa Museum. Her mother, Demeter, is thought to have been seated beside her, but very little of this goddess survives. Like Cybele from Moschato, the two goddesses were displayed on a low pedestal in what was more or less a bare room, although bases of other statues were found outside this temple. Another way of displaying special statues in a sanctuary was to shelter them in a temple that no longer functioned as the main house of the cult statue. A case in point is the little temple of Nemesis at Rhamnous. It is a Doric temple in Antis, built in polygonal masonry after 480 BC, and it was abandoned after a new, larger temple was erected next to it in the 3rd quarter of the 5th century in order to house the new cult statue created by Agorakritos around 430. When Pausanias visited the sanctuary, he was so impressed by the statue by Agorakritos that he thought was by Phidias, and its elaborate statue base that he completely neglected to mention the smaller temple in polygonal masonry. This drawing, which I showed you earlier, is an artist's impression of the cult statue of Nemesis and the offering temple which was set in front of her. The statue of Nemesis was about 3 meters high and she was placed on a low pedestal which was not far removed from the spectator. There is no evidence of other statues in this temple, but when the earlier temple next door was excavated, it was found full of statues placed there in different periods, and this is the ground plan of the small temple. The earliest surviving sculptures are two under life-size female statues, now in the Athens National Museum. One dates from the late archaic period and stands on the left, and the other is from the severe style on the right. The archaic statuette on the left was no doubt moved from the archaic temple before its demolition and replacement by the severe style temple. Did this statuette function as the cult statue despite its small scale? This has been argued, but we will never know. Next in date, and found in this small temple, is an under life-size figure of a young hero in Heraion marble. It was dedicated by Lysiklaides, and the dedicatory inscription says, to the goddess who owns this sanctuary, but he doesn't specify who the goddess is. Its inscribed pedestal is made of Eleusinian limestone. Its similarity to the figures of the Nemesis base suggests a date between 430 and 420, and the statuette is thought to be a product of the workshop of Agoracritus. It is now in the Athens National Museum, and that's where you can find the next statue, an over life-size statue of Themis, who was worshipped in the sanctuary alongside Nemesis from the 4th century on, was also found in this small temple. Her inscribed base informs us that it was made by the sculptor Kairestratos of Rhamnous and was dedicated to Themis by another local man, Megacles of Rhamnous, in commemoration of his sponsorship of athletic and dramatic contests which were held during the priesthoods of Callisto and her successor Philostrati. Here we have an interesting case of a priestess who dies during her term and is immediately replaced by another priestess, and this we know from many inscriptions where whoever dedicates something in the priesthood of Callisto mentions the next priestess as well. This statue dates from the end of the 4th century. Another statue of the 4th century, which was a bronze portrait of Antiphilos dedicated by his mother, has now vanished and has left only the inscribed statue base that you see here. Also, the head of a goddess wearing a polos was found in the same temple, along with a life-size portrait of Aristonoi, priestess of Nemesis and Themis, with her inscribed statue base, and this also is in the National Museum. The dedicatory inscription says that it was dedicated to the two goddesses by her son, Hierocles of Rhamnous. The inscription is dated to the middle of the 2nd century BC by the letter forms, although archaeologists who only looked at the statue used to date it to the 3rd. But once you combine the inscription with the statue, you realize you have to lower this by a century. Finally, a headless archaistic statue, which came to light in 1813, was removed to the British Museum by Gandhi Deering, and I was lucky enough to see it on Monday in the storerooms, but I don't have a photo to show you. Well, now we do not know how the statues were arranged in the interior of this temple. The drawing here on the left is only an indication on how to fit some of these statues in the available space. It has been suggested that the statues were put in a completely haphazard way, and that the temple was used as a storeroom. But judging by the practices of other temples that we will be discussing, I think it was treated as an extension of the large temple, for the display of votive statues for which there was no room in the other temple. So they would have been displayed in a nice, much nicer way. On other occasions, space for dedicatory statues, if it could not be found in the cella, would have been found in the pronos. A good case in point is the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. When Pausanias visits the site, he is impressed by the colossal statue of Zeus by Phidias within the cella, and he describes it in detail, no less because of the very precious materials. Zeus sat on a throne decorated with figural scenes. The statue base was made of Eleusinian limestone, which Phidias brought along with him from Athens, and carried a gold relief frieze. The space around the statue was closed off by means of painted panels, which you can see down there. So the spectator had to admire this statue from a distance. And the floor in front of the statue was lined with dark limestone blocks, while the stylobate of the interior columns was covered with white pentelic marble, forming a contrast with the coloring of the floor. The pronos of this temple was reserved for the dedicatory statues. Pausanias saw here a diminutive bronze chariot group dedicated by Kainiska, the sister of King Agesilaus of Sparta, after her second Olympic victory in the chariot race in 392 BC. A statue base signed by the sculptor Apelles, son of Callicles, found in the pronos, is attributed to this monument, and this statue base is now just outside the Olympia Museum. Apelles had also signed the first bronze chariot that was dedicated by Kainiska after her first Olympic victory in 396, 4 years before the other one. Kainiska was the very first female Olympic victor, and she boasted of this in her original dedicatory inscription that has survived. In the Roman period, 2 imperial portrait statues were added here, one of Trajan, which was dedicated by all the Greeks, and another of Hadrian, dedicated by the Eleans. If one adds to these statues a votive throne, a bronze tripod, 25 shields used in the armed race, as well as 4 wreaths dedicated by the Emperor Nero, one begins to acquire a sense of the clutter that accumulated in Greek temples over the years, turning them into depositories of artifacts. And I think the word clutter really characterizes what the spectator would have seen in a Greek temple. And they would have really looked like very cluttered museums. Overcrowding did not cancel the function of temples as sacred spaces. The constant addition of statuary to the existing arrangements indicates flexible rules of display in an effort to accommodate newcomers, all intended as tokens of piety to the deity worshipped in the sanctuary. We will now examine 2 paradigms of temples that were gradually filled with statuary over the centuries in order to accommodate privileged dedications wishing to be in close proximity to the divine. We begin with the Temple of Hera at Olympia, which was built in the beginning of the 6th century BC. From this period on until the 1st century AD, this temple eventually came to accommodate 24 statues, in addition to luxurious furniture like the chest of Kypselos and the gold and ivory table by Kolotis, which served for the placement of wreaths for the Olympic victors. The Heraion initially accommodated the cult of Zeus as well as that of Hera. The cult of Zeus was eventually moved to the Temple of Zeus, which was built much later. The very long interior of this temple was articulated by means of two colonnades dividing the space into three aisles, and you can see a drawing down on the left. Alternate columns were attached to the cella by spare walls, thus creating niches for the display of statues. When Pausanias visited the Heraion in the 2nd century AD, he saw a cult group of Hera seated and Zeus standing wearing a helmet. He described them as simple works, presumably meaning early archaic. That's what we would call them. He then proceeded to enumerate a number of gold and ivory statues of the first half of the 6th century BC, placed in the niches on either side of the cult group. This date is suggested to us by the names of the sculptors, who we know were very early archaic sculptors. And Pausanias very kindly gives us their names. The Aeginetan Smilis made the Seasons, who were seated on thrones, while the Spartan Doricleidas made their mother, Themis. Another Spartan, Theocles, made 5 Hesperides, and the third Spartan, Medon, created an Athena. The concentration of Spartan artists is very interesting and may be of particular significance, perhaps pointing to a Spartan dedication, and it also points to an early date. The next statues of gods named by Pausanias are anonymous, but he says they appear very early and primitive to him. Demeter and Kori, Apollo, Artemis and Leto, Tyche, Dionysus, and Victory. And then says Pausanias, at a later date, more statues were dedicated in this temple, and he enumerates 4 statues of the 4th century BC, thus allowing for a gap of 2 centuries between the 6th and the 4th. Nothing is deposited there. He mentions a bronze statue of Aphrodite by Cleon of Sicyon, who was a 4th century member of the Polycleitan school, but this statue has completely disappeared. A gilded statue of a seated child by Boethos of Carthage, a sculptor of the 2nd century BC, was set up before the Aphrodite, and this too has vanished. Nearby, Pausanias saw a Hermes carrying the infant Dionysus by the famous Praxiteles. By lucky chance, the Hermes came to light in the excavations of 1877 in the second niche on the right as one walks in from the pronaos. The statue base carries no inscription and is in fact a replacement which dates from the 1st century BC, thus 300 years after the statue. Both the statue and the base have generated endless controversy. Is the statue a 4th century original or a replacement of the 1st century, and that is why we have a 1st century base? We don't need to go into any details here, except to say that the fact that the Hermes is made of Parian marble reinforces the arguments in favor of an original 4th century date, because almost all late Hellenistic and Roman statues in Olympia are made of Pentelic marble. There is one exception that we will discuss very soon. The replacement of the base and the rough back of the Hermes that you can see on the right screen indicate that there was damage to the statue, but we do not know if it was removed to the Heraion after it was damaged, or whether the damage occurred while it was in place in the Heraion. And there is no way of knowing whether the Heraion was its original location. But Pausanias implies no. He says afterwards they deposited statues in here. So there is an implication that it was moved here. The 2 other 4th century statues that Pausanias explicitly says were removed to the Heraion from another location were the portraits of 2 Macedonian royal women created by the Athenian Leocharis for the Philippion, a rotunda dedicated by Philip II of Macedon around 336 BC to house dynastic portraits of his family. Unfortunately, these statues are all gone. When Pausanias visited Olympia, he only saw the portraits of Philip himself, his father Amyntas III, and his son Alexander the Great inside the Philippion. He specifically mentioned that the two royal women, Eurydice and Olympias, had been relocated to the Heraion, but he doesn't say why. What was the reason for the removal? It cannot be argued that the two statues were moved to the Heraion for protection, since they were equally well protected in the Philippion. Various reasons have been proposed over the years, but the solution, I think, lies in the political history of Macedonia after the death of Philip II. Alexander's mother, Olympias, who was removed to the Heraion, was murdered by Cassander in 316 BC, after which Cassander married Thessaloniki, Alexander's half-sister, by a different mother, and thus became legitimized as a ruler of Macedonia. The removal of Olympias from the dynastic group of the Philippion may well be attributed to Cassander, who didn't want to remind anybody that Olympias was not the mother of his queen. The removal of Eurydice, on the other hand, depends on the identification of this figure, because there are two possible Eurydices. Philip II's mother was called Eurydice, but his last wife, also known as Cleopatra, was also called Eurydice. Philip married this Eurydice Cleopatra in 337, thus causing a deep rift between him and Olympias and her son Alexander. After Philip's murder, Olympias killed Eurydice Cleopatra and her newborn child to protect Alexander's claim to the Macedonian throne. If the statue of Eurydice in the Philippion represented Philip II's mother, it was in nobody's best interest to remove her. If, on the other hand, she was Philip II's last wife, who represented a great threat to Olympias and Alexander, it stands to reason that Alexander would have removed her portrait from the dynastic group after he became king of Macedon in 336. It is therefore reasonable to assume that the two royal women of Macedonia were removed from the Philippion to the Heraion within the last years of the 4th century, so very soon after they were set up. After the intense activity documented in the Heraion in the 4th century, we have another gap of many centuries, until the 1st century AD, when 4 female portraits turn up, 1 in the cella and 3 in the pronaos. Pausanias does not mention them, but the archaeological record preserves them. The colossal statue of a woman in Parian marble, and that's the only example of Parian marble statue in the Roman period, in Olympia. The colossal statue of a woman in Parian marble was excavated in the niche next to that of Hermes inside the temple. Her statue base has disappeared, and we do not have any inscription to identify her. When she was excavated, she was identified with Poppaea Sabina, who was married to the Emperor Nero from AD 62 until she died of natural causes 4 years later. As we have no coin portraits and no documented sculpture portraits of this empress, this identification has been contested, especially because her hairstyle is a mixture of coiffures of the Neronian and early Flavian period. Her twisted fillet prompted the suggestion that she was a priestess and therefore not an empress. On the other hand, the fact that she is the only Roman portrait found in the cella, and being also the only Roman statue in the sanctuary made in Parian marble and not in Pentelic, may indicate an imperial commission that was not executed by Athenian sculptors, as were all the other imperial portraits found in the sanctuary and signed by Athenians, but imported from an unknown workshop. If she is indeed Poppaea, and I think she is, she may have been originally set up in Dimitron alongside other members of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, but was removed from Dimitron to the Heraion when Nero suffered damnatio memoriae. So we really have a third displaced queen. After Olympias and Eurydice, Poppaea suffers the same fate, and she's separated from her husband because nobody liked Nero. We conclude our survey of statuary in the Heraion with 3 private portraits of local women of the 1st century AD, made in Pentelic marble and erected in the pronaos and not inside the cella. We assume that these portraits were relegated to the pronaos because they were neither divine nor imperial. Their inscribed statue bases are still in situ, and that's how we have the information. The earliest statue base is on the left as we go in. It carried an honorary portrait of Claudia Alkinoa, whose husband had dedicated a victory monument in honor of an Olympic victor in AD 53, and this gives us a date for Claudia Alkinoa. A portrait of her granddaughter, Numisia Tisis, was later set up to the right of the entrance, so the 2 women, Claudia Alkinoa and her granddaughter, flanked the entrance to the temple. A 3rd pedestal carrying a statue of Antonia Cleodiki was finally erected next to that of Numisia Tisis. The head of a woman in a Trajanic hairstyle found next to that pedestal was plausibly attributed to Antonia. Now 3 headless statues of women were found near the exterior colonnade of the Heraion and probably must be associated with these pedestals. All 3 are signed by Athenian sculptors. 2 signatures appear on the figure's drapery and the 3rd one on the plinth. We have the names Eleusinius, Eros, and Aulus Sextus Eraton. The fact that these sculptors did not sign on the statue bases indicates that they created these statues in their workshops in Athens, shipped them to Olympia, but didn't travel with them, having no involvement with the manufacture of their bases, which do not mention the makers. And we conclude with Messene. The final temple we will be discussing today is the late Hellenistic chapel of Artemis in the Asclepion complex of Messene. It offers an invaluable record of sculptural display thanks to the survival of 14 statue bases found in situ, and 7 of them are inscribed. They were arranged in 2 semicircles flanking the cult statues, while 2 additional bases were placed in a lateral room. The temple dates from the 2nd century BC, and the dedications go down to the 2nd century AD, so we have 4 centuries of activity. The chapel's entrance was on the east, and it was divided in 3 aisles by means of 2 Ionic colonnades. The cult statue base is over 3 meters long, indicating that it supported a group rather than a single statue of Artemis. An offering table and a treasure box were placed in front of the base. The votive inscriptions and on the pedestals inform us that Artemis was worshipped with the epithets Orthia and Upisia, while Pausanias adds a 3rd epithet, Artemis Phosphoros, which has a meaning because we will see there are torches involved. Her cult was served by girls who participated in sacred rites and the priestess. Statues of the girls were dedicated in the temple by their parents, while statues of priestesses were dedicated also in the temple by their husbands or by the sacred elders who administered the cult. One of the pedestals closest to the cult statues, which is probably also one of the earliest, carried the statue of the girl Mego, dedicated by her parents, who had served as priests and priestesses. The dedicatory inscription describes the girl's duties. She had carried the goddess's xoanon, and she also had carried the torch for lighting the altar, so it was a nocturnal ceremony. This is borne out by the fragment of an arm wearing bracelets and a finger ring, and holding a herm, which was presumably the cult statue, the portable cult statue of the goddess, because we've seen that the real cult statue was very big. The statue base on the other side of the cult statue base is signed by the sculptor Demetrius from Alexandria, who was active in the 1st century BC. He also signed other works in Messene, notably a Heracles statue. The two statue bases, which were placed in the lateral room on the right, on account of their larger size, carried the statues of the priestess Theophania, wife of Damophon, who was a descendant of the famous 2nd century sculptor of Damophon of Messene, and the other base carried the statue of the girl Timareta, one of the girls who participated in the rites, dedicated by her parents. Finally, 3 cylindrical bases in the main room carried statues of the priestesses Irene, Callis, and Claudia Sitiris, all dedicated by the sacred elders of the sanctuary and dated to the 2nd century AD. The placement of these statues is not in chronological order, but appears to have been rather haphazard. They begin with chronological order, so the earliest statue bases are on either side of the cult statue base, but then they give up, and so you can find these bases just anywhere. The fragments of 5 late Hellenistic life-size statues of girls and 3 Roman statues of priestesses, also under life-size, came to light in the excavations of the temple, and here they are on display in the Messene Museum. The girls wear the same kind of costume, a ceremonial garment, a chiton with long overfall, which is belted high above the waist. The priestesses, on the other hand, wear a peplos over a chiton and a himation on top, and they are dependent on classical prototypes. They are not original creations. The statuary type of the priestess on the right is a variant of the cult statue of Nemesis of Rhamnus by Phaedias' pupil Agorakritos. It stands to reason that all these statues were dedicated after the term of service had expired as a thank offering to the goddess. First you serve your term, then you merit a statue. The overcrowding of the central aisle of this temple obviously did not bother the temple authorities, although they did make sure that the statues and their inscriptions were visible and within easy access. At the last phase of its existence, the Temple of Artemis would have looked like a very overcrowded museum. It has become clear by all this that sculptural display in temples was really a haphazard affair, and that there were incessant efforts to accommodate new dedications as they came in, thus constantly changing the landscape. What we see today is the last phase of temples as they appeared in the late Roman period. It is therefore hard to detect any patterns, and we will not try to do this today. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Olga. I think you have to stay here because we have just a few moments for questions. If anybody has immediate questions for Olga. If you have, I'm instructed to tell you now and later in the day to wait for a microphone so that the proceedings are recorded. I mean, one thing that occurred to me, going right back to the beginning of your lecture and thinking about immediacy versus awe. I mean, clearly the Nashville Athena and your awe reaction is one thing, but then the rather more sort of low and immediate cult statues that you showed, is there any evidence in antiquity for people touching or how they were relating to the cult statues in those smaller?
There is, yes. There is evidence of people touching in the case of the Cnidian Aphrodite, who was extremely sexy. And people went to Cnidos, they were sort of religious tourists. And the Cnidians, of course, encouraged this because they made money. So they did allow people to touch. And there is a story which may be apocryphal, that one pilgrim sort of stayed the night in the temple so he would be able to embrace the statue. But I don't know how he eluded the temple guards or priests or whatever, and he was able to stay there. But yes, I think people were allowed to touch. And sometimes we have evidence that they were touching so much that statues have been eroded by touch. Like there is a statue of St. Peter's in Rome, but I think also there is an ancient statue in the Athenian Agora that was touched because they thought it brought good luck, and it was, of course, a statue of Tyche.
Oh, yes, of course, that makes every bit of sense. Are there any other questions or comments that somebody would... Yes, the gentleman here, sort of halfway down the central aisle. You have to come back to my course.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Can we surmise that dedicatory statues might have been removed over the lifetime of a temple? Because it strikes me that some of these temples, you know, they were active for hundreds of years, and yet there's only a finite number of statues which have been found in them. So do you think there was a process of removal, replacement, renewal? Otherwise, one would find traces of countless statues. Or what were the criteria, perhaps, for meriting a statue in a temple?
Yes, we do have this evidence. There is a 4th century inscription from Athens, I think it's now in the Epigraphical Museum, that says that some bronze statues on the Acropolis were damaged, and therefore the priests were going to melt them down and make new bronze statues. So these were removed officially in the 4th century. Then we have natural catastrophes, like there was a big earthquake in Delphi and they had to remove, damaged statues. There is another case of a portrait of Alexander I of Macedonia, which was made of gold. He dedicated that to Delphi because he fought on the side of the Greeks, although he was really on the Persian side, but he was a traitor to the Persian side. So he dedicated this statue in commemoration of the Persian Wars. But when Pausanias goes there, the statue has disappeared, and we only know it from Herodotus. So either it was stolen or it was broken. Something happened to it. So yes, statues are removed, and also in the Acropolis, on the Acropolis, we have the phenomenon of removing portraits of the 4th century, reinscribing the statue base and dedicating portraits, especially of Roman generals of the 1st century BC, on the other side, and all these bases exist. So here is the base of Cleon, of Acharne, and on the other side it's Sala. So they did remove, or sometimes they didn't even remove them, they just changed the names of the statues. So we do have a lot of evidence of things happening.
Yes, there's a question over by the door.
Thank you. Just thinking about the painted panels in the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, and I was wondering if you could comment a bit more on the ways in which access to the display space and visibility of the statue was limited or not, and what effect that might have.
Well, we have only the evidence of Pausanias. And he says that you couldn't go under the statue because there were these panels, and you couldn't walk under the statue. On the other hand, Lucian, who also visits the temple, says he could hear the mice running up and down inside the statue because it had a wooden framework. So you could get near enough if you could hear the mice. No.
Oh yes, sorry.
You're talking about
Oh, sorry. Could you wait for the microphone? There it is.
Oh, hi. Just wanted to ask you that we know that thousands of statues were removed and brought to Rome. You know, in fact, the clutter of Rome was something to marvel at as well. In terms of Olympia, have you ever thought of the large element of statues that were removed and brought to Rome? I mean,
Well,
obviously thought about it. I mean, do we know in percentage terms how many might have been lost during the Roman period?
Pausanias saw an awful lot, and so they were not removed. On the other hand, bronze statues have been found in shipwrecks, like the Riace bronzes. And also there is a statue in the Getty Museum, the Getty athlete, who may well have been an athlete from Olympia that was removed, but some of these things were shipwrecked and never made it. And the Riace bronzes, no way can be Athenian. I know it has often been said that these statues were from Athens, but I think they were removed from either Olympia or Delphi because they belonged to a Peloponnesian workshop. The Italians tested the clay inside these statues, and they come from Argos. It's Argive clay. Therefore, it's the Polyclyton school, and there is no record of them, so they could have been in either sanctuary and never made it to Rome. And of course, we have the case of many famous statues that went to Constantinople, because Constantine removed many statues to Constantinople from Greece. It's not only that they went to Rome, they also went to Greece.
Thank you.
I think perhaps the last question for now, the lady at the back.
Can you tell us if any of the statues that were removed to Constantinople have survived?
I didn't hear very
She
well.
said, did any of the statues that were removed to Constantinople, have they survived?
Oh yes, we have the bronze snake. It was the tripod with the bronze snake that was holding up this tripod, and it had the names of the cities who fought against the Persians in the Persian Wars. And this snake was taken to Constantinople, and it still survives. It's actually still in the Hippodrome on display. And now we have a copy of that in Delphi. So you can see it in its original position, but it's only a copy. The original is in the Hippodrome.
And is that the only one that survives?
I think so, yes.
Oh, the horses of San Marco. A little voice from the front suddenly.
The horse of San Marco are Roman because they have mercury gilding, and they could come from anywhere.
Olga has an answer for everything. I think, if you'll forgive me, I will stop the conversation now on the basis that over the lunch break and later in the day, you will, of course, have the opportunity to speak to Olga directly and pursue any further questions.